General Motors is dropping electric van production at its plant near London, Ontario. The automaker says decreased demand has pushed it to stop making the BrightDrop electric delivery van.
Ontario's auto industry is being dealt yet another blow, with General Motors officially ending production of one of its vehicles.
Canada's auto sector has suffered another blow as General Motors is ending production of its BrightDrop electric delivery van in Ingersoll.
A quiet announcement can sometimes carry more impact than the loudest public confrontation, especially when it strikes at the core of a community already exhausted by years of economic uncertainty. When a corporation retreats from commitments that once defined the future of entire families, the consequences extend far beyond a factory gate. This moment has become a defining crossroads, forcing a country to confront what kind of nation it intends to be in an increasingly volatile economy. The shutdown of a single plant in Ontario now carries that weight, and once the news broke, it was clear the real story was never just about one facility. It was about a deeper shift in national identity, one raising uncomfortable questions across North America and drawing the attention of anyone watching what comes next. General Motors did not simply close a plant. Its decision disrupted the lives of workers who had built their futures around jobs they believed were stable and secure, positions that only months earlier had seemed guaranteed. On October 21, 2025, a short but consequential announcement from the company stunned the workforce. The BrightDrop lighting equipment plant in Ingersoll would never reopen. There would be no restart plan, no transition to a new product line, and no redeployment program for employees. Everything ended abruptly, with a firm and unexpected decision affecting more than 1,200 families. The news felt like a blow to the very foundations of their lives built carefully over many years. Workers who had devoted their entire careers to the production line suddenly lost the income that covered mortgages, funded their children's education, and secured their retirement. Many had been part of the plant long before BrightDrop technology existed, back when electric delivery vans were still a distant concept inside GM's development plans. They believed they were helping shape a major advance in Canada's industrial future. Now they are left facing emptiness, uncertainty, and unanswered questions about what lies ahead. Parents are now forced to explain to their children a disruption they themselves can barely understand. In the eyes of affected workers, this was not a routine business decision. It was a broken promise. The sense of betrayal ran even deeper because the plant had once been promoted as a symbol of Canada's new vision for modern manufacturing. General Motors had repeatedly insisted that Ingersoll would become a cornerstone of its electric vehicle strategy. The company praised the skill of Canadian workers, highlighted close coordination with federal and provincial governments, and publicly thanked Ottawa and Ontario for billions of dollars in support to build a green, sustainable, long-term industry. At first, everything appeared aligned: technological innovation, job security, and national ambition. But over time, those early commitments began to erode. Each time GM was questioned about the plant's future, its answers shifted. First, the company cited weakening market demand. Then it claimed the shutdown was temporary. Later came vague and non-committal updates. By 2025, the production line had still not restarted, despite repeated assurances that it would. Layoffs, initially described as short-term, eventually became permanent. The prolonged silence only deepened the uncertainty. GM offered little clarity to explain its change in direction. To many, this felt familiar, a pattern long associated with large corporations operating in Canada. Remain quiet, wait for government concessions, and move on. But this time, the response was different. Fear of further job losses no longer kept people silent. Instead, it sparked a broader debate about who truly controls the future of Canada's industrial economy. 3 days later, Canada revealed it had anticipated this moment long before GM fully grasped the consequences of its withdrawal. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne issued a short, measured statement that carried unmistakable weight. There were no threats, no dramatic rhetoric, but for anyone familiar with trade policy, the message was immediately clear: that this moment marked a decisive turning point. The government statement confirmed that both GM and Stellantis had failed to honor their commitments to workers and to Ottawa. The wording may have sounded technical, but to corporate decision-makers across North America, its meaning was unmistakable. Canada had activated a special mechanism specifically designed for situations like this. Months earlier, the government had introduced the Auto Remission Framework, a tool created to ensure corporations uphold domestic production obligations without relying on prolonged political bargaining. The rule was straightforward. Companies that maintain operations in Canada retain access to tax advantages. Those that walk away from their commitments lose those privileges. Once the framework was applied, GM immediately lost nearly 25% of its duty-free import quota. The consequences were immediate and severe. From that point forward, every GM vehicle built in the United States and shipped into Canada was subject to a 25% tariff. A vehicle priced at roughly $45,000 rose to more than $56,000 almost overnight. Dealers could not absorb the increase, and consumers refused to pay the higher prices. Within hours, the financial shock had reached GM's headquarters. Stellantis faced even harsher penalties, losing half of its duty-free import quota and receiving a direct warning from Ottawa that additional measures would follow if the company continued violating its Canadian production commitments. There was no need for fiery speeches or televised confrontations. This time, the message was delivered in the only language corporations cannot ignore: policy backed by real, enforceable consequences. For decades, international automakers operated on the assumption that Canada would do whatever was necessary to preserve its domestic auto industry. Fear of job losses shaped countless negotiations between governments and corporations. When companies demanded financial aid, regulatory flexibility, or new incentives, those requests were usually granted. The cost of those concessions was often borne by workers, wages trimmed, benefits reduced, and plant closures treated as inevitable. Whenever Canada attempted to push back, it faced a long-standing dilemma: the need for investment without the leverage to enforce accountability. But the events of 2025 fundamentally changed that dynamic. Canada sent a clear signal that corporate pressure would no longer dictate policy. The Auto Remission Framework was not driven by emotion or reactive politics. It was built on pre-established legal principles, ensuring enforcement that was transparent and independent of individual discretion. Companies quickly grasped the implication. Once the mechanism was triggered, Canada no longer needed to negotiate for compliance. The rules were fixed. Access to the Canadian auto market now depended on meeting clear legal conditions. The uncertainty no longer rested with Ottawa, it rested squarely with the corporations. The creation of this framework marked a critical shift in Canada's economic strategy, signaling a move from a defensive posture to a more assertive stance toward global industrial giants. This development represented a watershed moment in Canada's relationship with major U.S. automakers. The tariffs were only the visible outcome. The deeper significance lay in Canada finally recognizing and exercising the leverage it had long possessed. Almost immediately after the tariffs took effect, General Motors urgently requested a meeting with Canadian officials. Until then, the company had largely ignored outreach, convinced Ottawa would never take firm action. That assumption collapsed under grim financial forecasts. Minister Mélanie Joly met directly with GM leadership and issued a clear directive. Within 15 days, the company was required to submit a concrete production plan for Ingersoll, including the vehicle model, a production timeline, and a roadmap for restarting the plant. There would be no more vague assurances or empty commitments. Failure to comply would mean the tariffs remained indefinitely. That message reverberated across the industry. Ford paused internal planning to reassess the risks of non-compliance. Chrysler restructured its Canadian leadership and publicly pledged cooperation. Executives who once assumed Canada would always bend to preserve jobs were forced to acknowledge that those days were over. For workers, this was not merely about tariffs. It represented a government prepared to defend its manufacturing base and the communities built around it, one no longer willing to allow relocation threats to be used as leverage. Within weeks, the GM case had become a lesson for the entire sector. A corporation that once viewed Canada as a convenient production option was now compelled to reassess the cost of treating its commitments lightly. The mechanism Canada deployed was insulated from political cycles and public outrage. It operated on clear, transparent rules that could not be bent to suit corporate interests. And for families in Ingersoll, The new policy restored a sense of dignity. Workers understood that their labor was more than a number inside a corporate balance sheet. It formed part of the foundation of a vital Canadian industry, and for the first time in many years the government showed it was prepared to act firmly to protect workers when their livelihoods were threatened. The effects of this decision extended far beyond the auto sector. Employees in energy, aerospace, and pharmaceuticals were watching closely, aware that this moment could set a precedent for future negotiations. The next phase focused on the deadline imposed on GM: 15 days to deliver a production plan that was detailed, credible, and verifiable. The company had to specify expected output, implementation timelines, and the exact role the Ingersoll plant would play in its global electric vehicle strategy. It was required to demonstrate that past commitments were more than carefully worded corporate promises. If GM satisfied the government's conditions, the tariffs could be reconsidered, but failure would make the penalties permanent, a scenario capable of disrupting supply chains, straining dealerships, and reshaping the broader North American auto market. This issue had grown far larger than any single corporation. The recent decision is redefining how global companies operate in and engage with Canada for years ahead. What began with the closure of one facility has evolved into a firm declaration of economic sovereignty and national leverage. Ottawa's message was unmistakable: access to the Canadian market would be granted only to companies that respect fairness, honor their commitments, and treat workers responsibly. The new legal framework ensures these standards are no longer optional but enforceable, and Canada is applying them with resolve and without hesitation. Meanwhile, trade tensions sparked by the Trump administration are unintentionally pushing Canada toward a country Ottawa once approached cautiously: China, and that shift is unfolding faster than many in Washington expected. Not long ago, images of Canadian and Chinese leaders meeting cordially seemed impossible after the arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver and China's detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in retaliation. Relations had sunk to historic lows, and many assumed the mistrust would endure indefinitely. Yet that dynamic has begun to change. At the APEC summit in South Korea, Prime Minister Mark Carney held a 40-minute meeting with President Xi Jinping, the first leader-level engagement between the two nations in 8 years. The encounter signaled that both sides are prepared to open a new chapter. A statement from the Prime Minister's office described the meeting as a significant turning point, emphasizing renewed economic cooperation and confirming plans for Mr. Carney to make an official visit to China. While unresolved disputes remain, including issues surrounding canola and electric vehicles, tensions with Washington have intensified. Talks between Mr. Trump and Mr. Carney had shown signs of progress until an anti-tariff advertising campaign by the Ontario government once again derailed negotiations. Mr. Trump halted dialogue, leaving Canada reacting to events. With the United States still its largest trading partner and China an increasingly influential rival, Ottawa now finds itself navigating an uneasy middle ground between two global economic powers. This evolving reality is driving a noticeable shift in Ottawa's approach. Many analysts argue that Canada's tone toward China has become more pragmatic and less rigid. Professor Lynette Ong of the University of Toronto describes this as a necessary adjustment prompted by global volatility, noting that policymakers are recalibrating relations, placing economic interests above ideological positioning. Domestic political voices echo this change. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, a frequent critic of the Trump administration, has publicly called for a more stable trade relationship with China. Beijing responded quickly, signaling willingness to lift canola tariffs if Ottawa reconsidered its own tariffs on imported electric vehicles, a clear indication that China sees room for cooperation at a moment when Canada needs alternatives. Public sentiment is reinforcing this shift. Recent surveys suggest Canadians increasingly view the United States as a greater economic risk than China, while skepticism toward Beijing remains. Frustration with Washington's repeated use of tariffs has led many to question